if I put my...
Hi, everyone. We are just getting started with our webinar today. We'll leave about 2 minutes to join, so we'll get started a little bit past the hour. If you want to say hello in the chat, feel free to do so. Let us know where you're calling in from. I'm Lexi. Hello from North Carolina. Hey everyone, I've gotten a Q&A. The chat seems to be disabled, so I'm gonna take a look at that really quickly, and thank you for letting me know. All right, I think we will go ahead and get started. I'll keep looking into the chat. We're seeing mixed responses, that some can access it and some can't. So I will try to get to the bottom of why that is. But that said, let us get started in just a moment. Okay. All right, so you are here at a PIN webinar. We are discussing inclusive communications at work. I'm looking into our chat function. The Q&A function is definitely active, so please use that if you have a question throughout the webinar today. My name is Lexi. I'm from PIN. I will be on chat with y'all once I figure that out. And I'll also pop back on to facilitate our Q&A. Some housekeeping things I want to let you know about. We do have a live transcript enabled. If you would like to view that, you can go to the More button in your Zoom toolbar and enable live transcript. You can also ask us questions through Q&A or chat once I troubleshoot that. We'll have about 40 to 45 minutes of discussion today on the webinar, with about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end, and we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions. We do have upvoting enabled on questions, so you are able to upvote questions that you would like to see answered. And with that, I'm going to take a back seat and hand it over to Stacy, one of your hosts for today's webinar, and Stacy and Breeze will introduce themselves.
Thank you, Lexi. Hello, everyone. My name is Stacy Nordwall. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am currently the head of employee experience at PIN. Previously, I was an early people team member at Culture Amp, so I've been HR in the HR tech space for quite some time and been at early stage startups for quite some time. And I also have a background in counseling psychology and communication. So I'm kind of bringing all of that into the work that I am doing today. Breeze, I will pass it to you.
Thank you, Stacy. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Breeze Harper. You could just call me Breeze. I've been doing diversity, equity, inclusion in mostly the ethical consumption food space for about 15 years. And over the last 2 years, I've expanded it to most nonprofits and for-profits that are interested in DE&I. I have a background in social science and cultural geography, with emphasis on understanding how race, class, gender, and other identities affect one's sense of belonging and how one feels that they are or not included in their environment. And just really happy to be working with Penn on this really important project on inclusion and equity and communication. And I'm calling in from Ohlone land, Lishan Ohlone land, and that's also called Berkeley, California. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And if you're wondering what we mean by pronouns, gender pronouns, it's important to communicate what your identity is, your gender identity is, and that we don't assume what someone is just because we see them, if we have the ability to see with our eyes, what we assume them to be. So it's good to let people know how they identify in terms of their gender and other identities.
Great. So thank you, Bruce. I want to start off the conversation today about really, the deeper why of why we're here, which presumably is that we are here today because we want to learn how to create a more inclusive culture at our organizations. And I think as HR folks, often when we want to implement something new within our organizations, or we want to implement anything at all, we're asked really, okay, bring us the data, bring us the metrics. What is the business case for doing this thing that you want to do? And the data around the business case for the benefit of an inclusive culture within an organization exists. We've seen that. We see through it in the research that there's less employee turnover, increased innovation and performance, increased profitability. And that's not just a diverse culture, right? Because you can have a diverse group of people, but the environment also needs to be psychologically safe, trusting, and equitable. So within an inclusive environment, you can see the benefits from this business case. And I think the business case is where the conversation often begins, but I think that's also where the conversation internally, trying to get buy-in can often stall, because that doesn't get to the deeper why of why we're doing what we're doing. And that deeper why is usually it's the people, it's the mission, it's the vision, the values. And so, Breeze, I want to get your kind of, your take on like what is the importance of kind of moving beyond the business case, and how do you help people get maybe unstuck from just thinking about the business case and moving into the deeper why it's important?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great question. So until recently, it's always been, what is the business case for? And we're not going to just dismiss that. However, it's important to understand that not everyone who's part of a marginalized community wants to think, oh, leadership only cares because of bottom line. Like, still at the end of the day, it's all about money, and not the mere fact that I'm a human being who deserves to be treated fully human, that I should be able to be authentically myself. So it's more of a moral issue, not just the bottom line. So when we do our audits and our surveys of how the employees feel, significant numbers say this: they don't want diversity just to be something that the leadership do because of money. They want leadership to not just think about this in a more logical brainwave bottom line. They want to move it from head to heart. How can you do this where you open up your heart and realize that we all benefit, whether it's for business or not? That as human beings, if you treat everyone equitably, that we blossom and bloom, and then we feel like the leadership actually gets it, that it's because they actually perceive us as humans first, not the bottom line first, that this actually matters. And we also notice that when leadership understands the shift from just this in the brain logic, bottom line, to the heart, and understanding the moral and rights implication of treating everyone equitably and putting action in that, then the employees themselves feel that the actions are actually happening, that the leadership actually want to do this, and that they're moving things along. So that's one of the reasons that we're trying to shift the language. We can look at business case. Yes, that's great, but also align it with the overall arching concept of it's a moral and ethics case for treating people who have not been treated fully human for a long time, to start doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I think that was really, when we were talking earlier, something that really resonated with me was the idea, like, people don't want to know that you're doing something that involves them just because of the business case. Like that's not a motivating thing to come to the workplace and think I can only come here because a business case was presented that says this should be an inclusive environment for me.
Yes. And, we're talking about language today, but what's been very controversial over the last few years is we tolerate tolerance. No, I don't want to just be tolerated, right? I want you to include me because you sincerely want to do that in your heart, because tolerance is a very low bar. So let's move the language beyond tolerance to treating us equitably. And as we're all human beings that want to enrich our lives as human beings, that's the bottom line.
Yeah. So we have a Mentimeter that we'd like to show everyone, basically to understand, and this will help us with tailoring this discussion. Why do you want to create an inclusive culture at work? What is the deeper why for why, why you're here today? Why creating inclusive communications is important to you? Why creating an inclusive culture at work is important to you? So if you can go to those who have joined us, if you can go to the Menti and enter the code, and we'll have a nice word cloud that gives us an idea of what's bringing everyone here today and what your deeper why is, what's motivating you.
And for those who are on a phone, we can read them to you. So we're seeing these come up: making all feel welcome and included. Another one is employee retention engagement. Someone just wrote, it is fundamentally the right thing to do. Stacy, did you want to read some?
Yeah. So all are included as themselves without masking or hiding themselves. We have our workforce expects it. It's table stakes. And yeah, I think that's especially over the past few years, we're seeing that there's real expectation from the workforce for that. We have creating a culture of belonging.
Equal treatment of all our team members across the world, feeling like they can be themselves at work, having a safe, comfortable, inclusive environment. If it is, let's see, it is one of the steps in dismantling systemic inequity. So there's a lot of good thoughts around why people are here. So that's great that everyone's sharing this. Really important.
Yeah. I love to see all of this, and we'll be able to share this and a lot of the other resources that we talk about within this session we'll be sharing afterwards. So this will be one of the things that we share as well. And this will be kind of a great motivator to return to the why of why we do this work, which is important sometimes to have that grounding. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So as we start diving into the inclusive communication framework, for those, some of you may have come here because you saw the inclusive communications guide. If you haven't had a chance to view that yet or to read that yet, you will get to access that at a link to access that at the end of this webinar. But before we go into that, one of the things I wanted to kind of give a brief intro about was how this all came about. And for me, it was as part of my role at PIN, I'm creating the communications that is in our library of employee communications that customers can send out to their employees. And so as I was going through and writing some of these, I really had in the back of my mind, our customers could be anywhere. Their employees could be anywhere. How can I be sure that I'm writing something that is really going to be inclusive? And I started doing some research, looking at what was out there. And there were a lot of things, really good resources that were out there, particularly around, specific language to use or not use and why you would use it or not use it. But I felt like there wasn't something that kind of helped me to think through how to actually go about writing communication that wasn't just focused on, particular words. And so Lexi and I, who you all met earlier, got together and talked about it and said, well, if it doesn't exist, let's write it. And so we got together with Breeze, and this is how the framework and the guide were created. And really, it's meant to be just this guide that helps you think through how to write and create your communications. And what we suggest is, it's something you have to practice, right? You're not going to go through it and you'll just whip through it the first time and crank it out. Like, it will be something that takes a bit more concerted effort, and it will become second nature after time. It will become that habit that you develop. But starting off, we suggest you use a message that you have, something that you send frequently that will be high impact, that you can go through and use as the first message that you try the framework on. And generally for people, that tends to be something like an onboarding message. So we have a template, a sample onboarding message that we're going to use as our example as we're going through this. If we can go to the next slide that has the, thank you. So the sample message, which I'll read for everyone, is, "Hi, Carol. I'm excited to welcome you to ABC.org. The first days at a new job can be both exciting and overwhelming. There can be a lot to take in, and we're sure you're eager to hit the ground running. We want to ease your mind about what you can expect to help make your onboarding as smooth as possible. We've got a bunch of things planned for your first week, including lunch with your team. Check out your schedule below for the details. Let us know if you have any questions, and we'll see you at 10 a.m. on date at address." So with that, we can dive into we can start talking through the communication framework.
So it's important at first when you're conceptualizing a message to really think about who is your audience, right? And this can be often overwhelming to think about, but there's already blueprints and data that will help you along. So first of all, who are you focusing? Is it, new hires, an organization as a whole, senior leaders? So that's important to know. And then how can I know what the possible demographics of the audience are? And how can I kind of address these needs in communication? So it's important to understand that I'm here in the United States, and if I'm dealing in a certain sector, say I do a lot of work with animal rights and law, and predominantly it's mostly white lawyers from predominantly like the top 25 colleges. So I'll often the message assumes that everyone is in that framework. So sometimes we have to think about, in the United States, we know that there are people participating in animal rights, and they're part of marginalized groups. So we know that in the United States, there's racial and ethnic minorities, there's class minorities, religious minorities, and you may not be in the United States, you may be in another part of the world to try to figure out what demographics are most marginalized, and also what demographics usually show up most in your sector. So we use data such as from the Institute of Othering and Belonging at UC Berkeley, where every year they have an inclusive index where they'll show, I think, the top 50 or 100 nations, who are the most marginalized communities, what they're facing. And then when you're thinking about framing your communication, you can think about, oh, in my region, this particular tribe or this particular gender are most marginalized in my sector. So I want to start thinking about, as I'm onboarding, not to assume that someone's part of the mainstream, but they're actually maybe part of the marginalized. So by default, we can start with that message. We also don't know when people come to us what their gender identity is. So in this message, we shouldn't use titles that assume that their gender is this or that. So you can start off by just saying hi, then their name. I'm excited to welcome you to ABC.org. So when you do things like that, someone already feels welcome, especially if they're a gender minority who may be, non-binary and may go by they, them, they. It makes them already feel that, okay, at least in their language and frameworks, they understand gender spectrum, and that I feel like I belong. So that's one of the things that are important when you greet someone, to not make those assumptions. And we have assumptions based on unconscious biases, at least here in the United States, where gender is assumed to be a binary of woman or man, girl or boy, and then we greet people that way. Okay. So next slide. Okay, let me just, I'm trying to position it with mine as well. And then we talk about, what is the best format for the communication. So the format you select will be influenced by the tone and desired outcome of the communication, as well as considerations like the information you're conveying and how discoverable it needs to be. For example, your communication may take the form of email, Slack, presentation at a company-wide meeting, company policy or program, page on an internal wiki, or event invitation. Early onboarding messages are commonly sent by email or text. In the case of an onboarding message, something which is crucial for new hires to receive, the message is best sent in a format that is easily acceptable by the recipient. So this is really important when we deal with a lot of our clients. Most people have access to email or text, but depending on where you're working, we had people who are working in a factory and they didn't necessarily have access to technology the way that those in corporate did. So we had advised them to do different types of maybe messaging through a system where you actually make an announcement. You post things on the bulletin board that's actual paper and bulletins. So that was just thinking about the reason that a lot of the manufacturer plant workers were not getting the messages is because they just weren't using the same technology. So really thinking about what formats are best and what technologies are best to reach your audience.
And then the next question that we have people walk through in the framework or think through on the framework is, what should the tone of this communication be? So depending on the content and context of the message, a bereavement message and an onboarding message are going to have different tones. It's going to be what's appropriate to that. A bereavement message is probably going to be more solemn, an onboarding message more exciting. And also the tone is also going to be influenced by not just the format, which Breeze talked through, but also how formal or informal is your organization or the culture that your organization is in. So in a really formal organization, if your message has a lot of emojis and exclamation marks, that's probably going to be misaligned with the tone that is appropriate to the organization or to the culture. And then we also think about what is the outcome of the message that you want. So for the outcome, if you're sending something, if we can go to the next slide, thank you. If in the outcome for the message, if you are trying to get someone to take an action, you're trying to get them to sign up for benefits or something like that, the message should be very clear that this is the action that needs to happen. This is how you complete it. This is when and where, all of the information needed so that that action can take place. Or if the outcome that you want is you want the person to be informed about something. I think sometimes we can have the feeling like I need to provide all of the information possible on this subject, when what the person might need to know is this one small sliver. So provide them that. If you want them to know that, provide them that bit of information, and you could link out or provide other resources as necessary, but make sure that that one piece of information is clear if that's the outcome that you need from sending your communication. And then we kind of dig into like this big meaty part of the framework, which is about assumptions, which Breeze was talking about earlier. And yesterday when we were preparing, what you said, which I really loved, particularly around this, is that it's creating mindful habits around deconstructing assumptions. And that really, I don't know, I just really loved the idea of like, that's what you're working through as you're doing this.
Yeah. And, beyond just the message of the onboarding, this reminds me of when we had a client ask us to look at a message about greeting people who may become part of their workforce. And they were saying that, we're located in a safe neighborhood, right? And immediately I thought about, well, safe for who? So this was a neighborhood that was largely white. It's a tech area, and it has a history of being a sundown town. And if you don't know what a sundown town is, most likely you're either not from the United States or you're not a Black, brown, indigenous person who had to be out of town working by 6 o'clock. So though that's not legal anymore, there's still the history of what that means in the future and how someone feels. And there's issues around racial profiling and police, and that most of the safest neighborhoods in the United States are usually white. So what does that mean? So, just asking to have the employer think about when the use of safe and what that may mean for perspectives who are not white, middle class, straight, at least expressing their gender in a way that looks conforming, where they can actually feel safe, right? So those are the ways that we're thinking about. And this is a habit that you have to get into, you practice it. So what assumptions are you making when you're creating the letter or the communique? that are connected to maybe race and ethnic individuals who are part of the status quo that you've learned over time, whether it's through advertising, through entertainment, books, ability, one's status in the military, their age. So really thinking about the assumptions we make. And when we think about this, it's easy to start realizing that we actually have good intentions, but if you have good intentions around these assumptions, the consequences are always inequitable, especially on those who are most marginalized. So when we look at this letter, we don't know what Carol's demographics are, right? So we weren't supposed to use Miss or Mrs. We were supposed to just use their name. So that's gender assumptions that we have. And then also, what can we assume about someone's ability to actually access information and how they get it? So we have an assumption that Carol has readily available internet or mobile access to read our message. We have also assumed that the building is physically accessible for Carol and accessible by whatever mode or transportation Carol uses. So sorry, I didn't read the message first. Let me read that first. So it says, "Hi, Carol. I'm excited to welcome you to ABC.org. The first days at a new job can be both exciting and overwhelming. The first days, sorry, I can't even see this. My apologies. So we want to, I'm getting confused about this. The accessibility of the building, I'm sorry. So you want to make sure when you have to not assume that everyone can just walk into a building, park close to a building, see a building. So when you create these messages, you want to have a framework that understands that, well, we should not assume that. So provide information on how the building will be accessible. If the person uses a cane or wheelchair, is blind, how they make it to the building. So in terms of the safety, we assume that the location of the office is safe for Carol, but should we assume that? We were talked about, what particular identities have more safety issues over others. And someone had wrote like how close is parking and assumptions that are made.
You mentioned in terms of parking, one of the things we had talked about in drafting the message was, okay, well, free parking, is it free parking or is it $40 a day garage parking? Because that could make a difference in terms of affordability for someone, right? And I think one of the things you mentioned too, which I'd love for you to talk more about, is this idea that, the assumptions come from our lived experience and the systems that we've experienced and what's in place. And so it's not that that people have ill intent, it's that that's what they've experienced. And so that's the lens they have.
Yeah, and that's what we all have. Even me as a DEI consultant, I have the embodied experience. I'm Anglophonic, right? I have formal education from Ivy League University. I'm fully able-bodied that I know of. And I create a lot of assumptions around this, but I have good intentions. But of course, that creates inequities and, exclusions of those who are not. So this isn't about am I a bad or a good person? It's about breaking habits, but it's hard to break these old habits if you're not creating a new pattern and a guide to make sure you check your assumptions before you create that communication. So that's the important, that this is always ongoing work. And it will never end. It's just habits. And the DEI, the language, the methods will change, and that's okay. Just like with any sector you're in, the technology changes. DEI, what we use, those tools are technology too. And you have to always practice and be up on it so you know what is the most effective way to engage in it. And you need to create those habits every day.
Mm-hmm.
So next slide.
Right, so here, go ahead.
Yes, you can go with it.
Yeah, so here is our revised message. After we had our sample message at the beginning, we've gone through and asked ourselves all of these different questions about what assumptions we might be making, have we included information around accessibility? And so we have a new message where we have highlighted some of the things within the message. It starts off fairly the same, but we've added information about the accessibility. So we say, when you enter the building, the stairs are just on your right and the elevators are past the main lobby area. The building is wheelchair accessible. So we've made sure that we're adding accessibility information. We've also made sure that we add information about the bus being 1 block away from the office. We've added information that includes how much the parking garage is, and what the employer will reimburse in terms of public transit. Do you want to cover the other half?
Okay. So, and it's of course, your team will take you to welcome lunch paid for by ABC, or because a lot of people, there's assumption that why can't you just afford a $10 lunch? A lot of people are not financially stable. So $10 for them may actually be a lot. So make that information clear. Do I have to pay for my own lunch or not? And then add your pronouns and name pronunciation in our HRIS before your first day. And that's of course important too. So now we know how to properly address someone's preferred gender pronoun. So this type of letter is very important. And yes, on dietary needs actually would be, thanks for, yeah, that's not highlighted, but the dietary needs are important as well. I practice veganism, so that's something I'm always thinking about, whether it be something more than iceberg lettuce for me to eat. So that's important. But remember, this is just a blueprint. Like we could write an entire dissertation just on this one thing, but this is just to get you started thinking about what could be missing because of the biases that you had when you created this. So a lot of good information is coming up from chat, people also saying you should write this and that. That's great, right? So these are the things that are already spinning in your head for you to think about on what to do as you create this. So once again, it's just a habit. This is one example, and we could spend a lot more time on every other word, but we want to get in the habit of just kind of asking these questions.
Mm-hmm. And so part of that habit, actually, I forget, before we go into this next part of the discussion, I want to ask people to put something in chat, because this will help us make the conversation more relevant to those who have joined us. If you can put in the chat what industry you're in and the location where most of your employees are, like country, region, whatever the location is. If you can drop that in the chat, that will help us in this, go through this next section. Part of as we've been talking about this whole idea of moving beyond assumptions and giving resources that help you think these things through, question those assumptions as you are creating your communications. If we could go to the next slide, we have our default reader profile that we've created and that we're going to talk through. And the idea about this default reader profile, as Breeze was talking about, you know, we have this lived experience. We have these structures that we've been used to, and that means, you know, we have a certain lens that when we would just go to write a communication, we'd be writing through that lens. And the idea of the default reader profile is if we make it a concerted effort to expand that lens, to make sure that we're including, you know, historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups within that lens, you know, thinking in particular about our location industry, which we'll talk about more. If we make sure to expand that lens, that means that what we're going to write is going to be so much more inclusive, and it's going to cover so many more people's needs. And so the default reader profile we've created is really about giving you a blueprint where you can customize that and you can think through. And Breeze will talk more about this. I'm seeing, it looks like we have a lot of folks within the US, primarily within the US, and we have a really broad group of people joining us in terms of industries. I'm saying healthcare and tech and so nonprofit, travel, news and media, like a really broad array of industries. So how does that information, people approaching it, how would they approach it given, you know, the different regions and industries that they're in?
Yeah, and this is essential because often people feel overwhelmed or they're like, I'm not in your part of the world, Breeze. Race isn't even a thing where we're from. So this is helpful. I know to a point, this Excel spreadsheet, race may not apply in your nation. However, maybe tribe applies. Maybe the most marginalized group historically have been religious minorities. So the point is to kind of think about it on a regional level, historically to the present, who has been most marginalized just throughout society. So that's one thing. And then also thinking about in your sector, what is the most prominent demographic and what assumptions have been made. So for example, perhaps you're in a sector where most people may be people of color. However, most of them are straight and able-bodied. And historically, those in that sector who are LGBTQ and disabled are not participating in it for various reasons, usually because of inequities that make it hard for them to get into that sector. So then how do you create language where the default person is someone who is a disabled person who's LGBTQ? So what would that framework, that communication look like? So in that particular region with the same sector, let's move to maybe a different nation, the same sector, you may have a completely different, prominent group of people where maybe most of them are light or white skin and most of them are straight and heteronormative. So historically, maybe the most marginalized have been ethnic minorities and people who are low socioeconomic class, people who are maybe caregivers of young children. So how do we create a language for that particular audience through mindful and inclusive communication? So once again, if you don't know that information, those demographics of where you're from, there's information that tells about your sector, what are the demographics in your sector, but also the region that you're in. If you go to, we'll provide this link, UC Berkeley, their Institute for Othering and Belonging, they literally have an awesome report every year that shows what are the most marginalized groups every year in each, like about the top either 50 or 100 nations. And they show the top 5 social and economic issues that are really creating inequities for marginalized groups. And that will give you a better understanding of how to frame and what languages that you should use as you're creating this communication.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think, it's important to say I don't think that we're creating this with the expectation that people would know all of that information, right? That's why we're going to be providing the resources as well. As you might not know, when you're looking through this, what the answers are, or who, which group you should be writing to. But this is going to help you kind of go through and think through that. And then you have the resources as well. And then you have the questions of, once you have this kind of default reader profile, this person in mind, that's going to be the lens you write through, you can answer these questions as well as, what communication preferences might this person have? What are the challenges that this person, thinking they're this much broader lens, what challenges might they be facing? And I'm going to take that and I'm going to put that information into my communication. So it's something that helps you, broaden that lens. And if you have that information in the communication, most likely you're covering a much broader group of people. It's going to be supportive of a much broader group of people's needs.
Yeah, and just to, because I want to remind people, this is an ongoing process. So, breathe. If you're feeling a little overwhelmed and anxious, it's okay. If this is new to you, it's an ongoing habit that you're going to practice. Nothing is ever 100%. So you're not going to cover everyone, but this is just making it more exclusive and preventing, less issues around exclusivity. But it is a work in progress. This isn't going to fix, the last few hundred years systemic oppression and its consequences in the workforce. It's not, but it is a start. It's a building block, and it's not going to solve problems overnight. So we're just trying to get people to understand it's a habit, and this is just one small gear in the many gears that are working toward an equitable workplace that should never stop, because it has to keep on being oiled, which is through your habits and practice.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's one lever, one tool that we have available that will continue to develop. And, as you mentioned already, language evolves. A lot of things evolve over time, right? So there is no, check, I've done it. Like every culture evolves, language evolves, people evolve. So it will always be a continuing journey of learning and habit making and habit unlearning, which is something we talked a lot about, is like, if however old you are, you've lived that many years with the things that you've learned, and maybe now you're learning new things, you're not going to unlearn the however many years you've lived things overnight, right? Like you have to go through that process of unlearning and relearning something.
Yeah, and to let you know, I'm a DA professional and I'm still unlearning assumptions I make. And I have very young children who it's part of their education in the Bay Area. They already are taught not to assume gender. So they'll say, Mom, where is that place? Where's that tree you're talking about? And I'll say, oh, see that guy right there, that man right there, that's the tree I'm talking about. He's next to it. And they're like, Mom, you just assume their gender, and I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. And the thing is, when you make a mistake, if someone points out in your communication that you didn't make a mistake, don't defend, don't make excuses, just say, you're right, I'm sorry, I will correct myself, and remember your gender pronoun is this. Thank you, and then move on. So accountability, you're going to make mistakes, and the most important thing you can do through this process is accountability and humility, because that's the only way you're going to actually change for the better in terms of inclusion. And do those practices, as you just admit that you're going to make mistakes, and it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, so that brings us, we'll kind of take a minute to compile all of the things that we've learned so far, all of the things we've talked about before we go into the time for our Q&A, which we're leaving a pretty good amount of time for. So get in there and put in the questions that you have for us. But to kind of talk through our takeaways, we started off by really talking about how to connect with your deeper why and move beyond just this idea of the business case and connecting to, ultimately we're doing this because we're trying to create an inclusive environment for people, because that is the right thing to do. And when you're starting this, we want you to start with just pick one message that you send regularly to use the framework on, and to try to update that and add in new information, maybe change some of the language that you're using. Just pick one and start with one message.
Okay. And then use the inclusive communication framework to write or update your message. And this is something like Stacy said, it's just practice, and kind of develop your default reader profile. You may have many, and it's going to change, and that's okay. As you learn more and more, things change. And it may change with more diverse employees even coming in and saying, hey, I love the onboarding process. However, these were the things that you assume. So you're just going to constantly need to update these things by being, pretty literate in the changing language of DE and I. So just really understanding that. And then I have said to my clients, the Institute for Othering Belonging, that inclusive index for all the differing nations has been really important for them to, as they construct that, and then understanding the demographics in your own sector and what have been impediments for more inclusion. So that's a really great way to start thinking about how you want to create your default reader profile. And then, as I said before, diversity, equity, inclusion, it's a continuous journey, and it really does require humility and accountability. And often I've worked with clients who have good intentions, and they're not necessarily used to being called out on their mistakes. So they often feel like, oh gosh, I feel so unsafe right now. I feel unsafe. No, you're not unsafe. What you're feeling is the natural discomfort of, conscientization, changing your paradigms, shifting and transforming into a more mindful person around equity inclusion. So that's what it feels like. So you may feel like, oh my gosh, that's normal, but have humility about it and be accountable for when you make mistakes, even if you had good intentions. And that's really important as you're moving through this, because you need to make mistakes in order to learn. You just have to have a culture that supports that mistakes are not failure. It's just an opportunity to transform and learn more with accountability.
Mm-hmm. And I think to your point, when you're doing anything that's a little bit new, or you're learning something new and you make mistakes, like any subject, anything, you're going to feel uncomfortable. And so why would this be any different? Like, you should expect that too. So I think we can go ahead and go into some of our Q&A. This is one, we talked about accessibility. So the question is, when it comes to accessibility, we are often challenged with balancing assumption and being proactive, meaning we don't want to assume accessibility and offer accessible services when we don't have employees with disabilities yet. However, as we look to expand our talent to include more people with disabilities, we should start providing offerings sooner rather than later. What are your thoughts on this, if this makes sense?
Okay, so that's great. And when we work with companies, especially when they're just starting up, we ask them to put everything in place from jump, because you're just going to have problems down the road when you don't actually start thinking mindfully about, we're putting a workplace together, and we want to make sure that we have accessibility tools. Remember, you may not be able to have everything, but just to actually start putting certain things in place. And then when you have communicate to potential employees or candidates to let them know that this is what we have now. We're really thinking about creating a space where people with disabilities also can thrive. However, we may not be there yet in terms of our budget, but we're looking into creating that for them. And then I have a client who really wanted to create job recruitment messages, and they didn't understand how to change the language so it was more inclusive of people with disabilities. So even when you put in those type of language that is inclusive of people with disabilities and you don't make assumptions, that in itself, I think of grammar and language as a technology that at least has the potential candidate or the already employee thinking, okay, at least you're already thinking in terms of not thinking of it as an able-bodied person. You're thinking along the lines of not everyone is able-bodied, and we're going to start thinking in those frames. And hopefully when we get to the point, creating structures that will help anybody thrive regardless of their ability. So I think that's important to put it at the beginning and make it clear, because if you can't do everything, you don't want to just be silent, but you want to give someone some indication that you're still thinking, your frames are thinking, yes, we understand that not everybody is able-bodied, so this is what we're going to offer and what we're thinking about.
Yeah, and I'd add that there might be some assumptions in there, right? Like there are assumptions around that there isn't anyone who currently has physical or visible disabilities. That's first what I think is in there. What I might ask, or what I might wonder is, is that's not there. To your point, is that some of that isn't there, that language or that mindfulness isn't apparent, that maybe that prevents some people with physical disabilities from applying or joining to begin with. And also, not all disabilities are permanent, right? You might have, or physical disabilities, you might have someone who experiences something where they have a temporary physical limitation, and then does that present them a problem with having accessibility within the workplace? So I think, to your point, this is why it's important to be on the kind of front side of doing that work, because if you're waiting until the person comes, it almost feels too late in a way, or
it's reactive, not preventative.
Yeah.
And I think about just, it's a sad story, but I was thinking about a mom. She fell down the stairs with her infant, trying to bring the stroller up the stairs. She fell down, she died. This was a few years ago, somewhere in the United States, right? But think about, someone built that structure assuming that everyone can walk up the stairs, and they don't have people who are like young children who have a stroller, right? So that's the consequence. So it's the same thing, is that just don't make the assumption, put it in now. And like Stacey was saying, you actually don't know what people's actual disabilities may be. They may not be visible, they may be temporary. So you put the structures in now so you don't have to deal with that. It's just, I'm a geographer by training. You have to think about the structures that were put in place that made assumptions here in the United States where I am, and then what the inequities have been because of those assumptions about people, a particular demographics and all the privileges that they had, and those who didn't have it, how it's actually affecting them now. So I always think about that when you're building the workplace. It's no different.
Okay, we have another upvoted question, which is, what's the best way to say that a location might not be safe due to crime or theft, and that people will need to be extra aware of their surroundings? SF tech companies host their events downtown. Some folks who aren't from the city are culture shocked with crime that happens on the BART train and crime in the Tenderloin that connects to Union Square.
That's a good question. So I have to think about this. I think it's important to actually just explain to people that you should be aware of your surroundings. Data has shown that we're having an increase in theft and assault. But I also think outside of crime where people are mugged for their belongings, it would be important also to notify if there are attacks on particular minorities in an area as well. So even though the question was about San Francisco in the Tenderloin area, I think it would also be equally important if an event were in a mostly white, rural area, which is assumed to be most people are, are not LGBTQ, but a lot of attacks may have been directed toward marginalized to actually make it clear that even though it's been said to be a safe neighborhood for most people, we want to let you know that there has been crime reports showing that gender minorities or racial minorities haven't been attacked. I think this is my opinion. Remember, what I say is not gold, but this is what I like to hear when I go out, because as a Black person who often goes out to certain things that are supposed to be safe, then learn that, oh, this used to be a sundown town. Why don't the organizations talk more about that when they're communicating their perception of safety and who needs to be more aware? I'd also ask when there are events being put together, organizers can think about default profiles as well. Like, we always want to put the event here, but let's think about how safe is it for the most marginalized?
Mhm.
And should we put it in a different space? I think that that's even more important is we know San Francisco is the hub of tech and all that stuff, but to think about ways in which you can put an event in a place that is safer around many levels, and asking who the default audience are and who you assume was going to go there to begin with.
Yeah, no, those are great call outs, because I don't know that I would have thought of some of those things for sure. And I know we've talked about this before in terms of trying to create inclusive events, that, being mindful if somebody's a caregiver and you're doing things at, in the evening, are they going to be able to go? Are you doing things that are surrounded or that are kind of primarily featuring alcohol, and who's going to go or not go because of that? There are a lot of different factors, what you're talking about in terms of like safety, accessibility, all of those kinds of things, which, using the default reader profile, even when you're creating events, could be something that's really helpful in terms of thinking, is this actually going to be an inclusive event? Is the location inclusive, all the activity, all of those kinds of things?
Yeah. So it's a lot, and I don't have all the answers, but that's why Stacy and I were recommending you create your own blueprints, your own default audience profile. And for the onboarding, it may be different from the communicator that's going to go out about, we want to organize an event this year, and we wanted to do this and that. So I think like I said, it's a habit and it's something that you have to constantly practice, but we can't cover all of this during this webinar, but these are really great questions. Write notes, take notes as we start thinking about that. And there's so many questions that are coming up. They're great questions.
I know,
So,
I like this next one, because it's around, what recommendations or resources could you share around inclusive communications related to neurodiversity?
yeah, we could actually, we can put that in the curated list of resources after, but that is something that is so important because I've trained myself. I'm actually an introvert and I am neurodivergent, and I had to learn, how to read certain social cues and stuff. And I think it's really important as when we work with clients who are like, we have a call for candidates, for this, and then we'll read it and we're like, we want someone who's outgoing, and like, vociferous and all this stuff. I'm like, but this is a neurotypical person. So how can we, create language in which someone who is on the spectrum of neurodivergency, where they have amazing talent, but they're not, a go-getter and extrovert, so how can we reframe the language in a way where people who are neurodivergent also feel that they can apply and feel like they would belong and not feel shame because during a meeting where most people who bark the loudest are thought to deserve a promotion, that the way they engage is not necessarily barking, but maybe they say one or two words and it's really, really thought-provoking and innovative, but that's it. So how can we even redefine that and get organizations to think about neurodiversity and what that means in creating inclusion? So we can definitely put that in the curated list of resources on how to make those environments more inclusive.
Awesome. Yeah. So we will send out, we'll do maybe, oh, Lexi, you go.
Hey,
That's we're at the
yes,
end.
we can include that resource. I just wanted to pop in since we have just a couple minutes left. And I think Andrea's question would be a great one to end on. Andrea's question is, how do you get reluctant staffers to buy in to using inclusive language, even though they think of themselves as not racist, sexist, homophobic, etc.? And I think this is a great last question, because it's, there's the part that we can control, which is in the discussion that we're having today, the communications that we write or send or speak. And then there's the other part of it, which is, how do I get more people in my organization to understand the importance of this? So I'd love for both of you to weigh in on this question. And thank you, Andrea, for the question.
So,
Bruce, do you want to start?
yeah, sure. Okay, so this is a huge question. And at the end of the day, you can't force anybody to do anything, okay? When we work with our organizations, we work with leadership first. And there are several things that are happening here. So it's important for leadership to first be on board with understanding that diversity, equity, inclusion is incredibly important beyond cosmetic, like checking a box. It's beyond just the bottom line, but it really is an issue of human rights, morality, and it will just garner a much richer workplace. So for leadership first have to start modeling it, that they mean it, that it's important. Another thing is it's really important to create curriculum, not just a 2-hour training, but offering ongoing training, career development, focus on equity inclusion that explains why equity inclusive language is important for that sector, meeting those goals, but also creating a workplace and where humans feel as psychologically safe as possible, so they then can start creating more innovation and overall aligning themselves better with and working toward the organization's goal. So I think a lot of people may not think that they're consciously biased, but training such as extensive unconscious bias trainings, the workshops that I give, and we've had these breakout rooms where people come back and say, I did the flashcards where I put up a flashcard. I'll say, picture a couple moving down the road with a baby. And almost everyone comes back with a straight couple walking down the road. And I said, I not say they were walking. I didn't say they were straight. And then they said they conceived of them as a baby who was biologically theirs, like they given birth to. I didn't say the baby could have been adopted. So, and then people started realizing, oh my gosh. Yeah. So, I never said they were walking, but you said they were walking. Like a few people who have people in their lives or they use maybe canes or wheelchairs, they didn't get that perspective, right? So it was really good to kind of use these unconscious bias trainings, these flashcards to start getting people to think about it. And then we'd say, okay, so you have these assumptions. These are the negative consequences, unfortunately, of those assumptions. So we'd show how that impacted the products, how they impacted campaigns, who is excluded from it and why, even though you had good intentions and even though I don't consider myself biased. So that's one of the many ways. So in tandem with this has to be a habit that you practice all the time. And that's how we've seen more of the buy-in. I don't know about the word, because it's still kind of the bottom line. And sometimes you can do that and people are just not ready. They just want to be in their own privileged world and they're okay with that. So I think you can do your best, plant the seed, explain to them what the consequences are of being unconsciously biased, whether you believe it or not, and then see what happens. But it's important for the leadership to do it, and for the leadership to start modeling it and creating habits so it kind of trickles down and the employees understand it's more than just good intentions. That unconscious bias has really severe negative consequences on equity. Stacy.
Yeah, so I would add, Lexi put in the chat, the guide, a link to the guide. We have an FAQ that is about like, what are some of the pushback things that I might get. So I definitely, would ask people to look there as well. So we have some guidance on that. One of the things that came to mind is, as you were talking, and +1 to everything Bree said, obviously, but I sometimes, with those folks, I kind of wonder if it's because they, their lack of, quote unquote buy-in is that they have this sense that, I don't want to be seen as, racist or sexist or homophobic, and that's bad. And then that would be my identity and, things like that. And it's like, we're not saying that those are not equal things, right? Like, it does not make you a bad person because you don't say the right things sometimes, right? These are not, it's about the actions that you take. It's about what you do, and some actions are going to be good, some actions are going to be bad. That doesn't make you a bad person, right? And it's really about going through and maybe helping that process along a little bit of like, okay, we're not trying to make you feel bad. We're not trying to tell you you're a bad person. We're actually trying to create this more inclusive environment that's just more welcoming to more people. And maybe, trying to help people make that shift a little bit will help their buy-in.
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. And like, we live in at least here in the United States, I live in a binary culture. It's either bad or good, right or wrong. And I ask people to shift over to a continuum way of thinking. You're on a continuum and a spectrum. And if you're in leadership position in an organization, with the exception of some things where it just needs to be canceled, don't do a cancel culture. Have a culture where it's accountability, humility. It's okay to make mistakes. We're in such a oppressive society. How could it have not affected your consciousness? Even myself, where I've internalized a lot of stuff about anti-Black racism, and I'm Black, right? So how can that not affect? So how can we create a culture where we're not saying you're bad, good, you're superior or not, but we're on a continuum, we acknowledge it. Those mistakes have been made that created these structures that are now creating inequities to human beings. So how can we move on, keep on building and growing and accepting responsibility and, trying to do what is morally right so we can all feel included. I think that's what we have to just remember. Like, binary thinking, get out of there. It's spectrums and continuums.
Yes.
Get out of there, binary thinking. What a mic drop moment. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Breeze. I dropped a link to the guide in the chat, and you'll get all the resources by email by the end of this week. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. And if you want to hear more about what I do collaboratively with organizations, the equity inclusion work, feel free to send me a message, sorry, on LinkedIn, or the email address that I believe was provided. I can type it back in if you have access to so I'll do that right now. And I'm also on LinkedIn, but I really enjoyed that you were able to spend an hour with Stacy and I and Lexi. So appreciate your time.
Thank you. Bye.